wanted to start with just leaving this slide up to tell you a little bit about myself. For the 50 or so people I saw earlier today, I apologize. You're going to hear that small part twice. You know a little bit about me professionally already and a little about me personally. Some other things I would add to that that were not said. I am from Iowa. So I am from Mason City, where I went through actually the Catholic school system all the way through Mason City, Newman. And then I went to Buena Vista University in Storm Lake, which several people in here have gone to as well. So I have been educated in Iowa until I was 22. And then I went to the University of Minnesota for my master's and then Lincoln for my PhD. I have Iowa. I'm about the only one who moved away from Iowa, actually. And another fact is, anybody from like the Northwood, Kensett area here by any chance? My dad is the mayor of Kensett, Tom Dakin, so I have that connection as well. So I feel very close to Iowa, and I'm in Iowa often, even though I teach at Creighton. Other things about me personally, you heard about my kids. One's going to be a sophomore at Creighton, one's going to be a senior in high school. Work at Creighton, and I'm also a trained facilitator for the Anti-Defamation League. And so I do anti-bullying teaching in schools, and when I do that, I appreciate all y'all's jobs so much when I'm around a lot of high school or middle school students, because it's harder work than it is with college students. I'm also, and this just becomes important in terms of how I integrate my own working and personal life, I'm a jazzercise instructor, and so I teach aerobics 5 or 6 days a week before I start my day. So those are things that I think help feed into you understanding my personal life. As far as professional life, I think you've heard most of what you needed to hear. I also just got back from a work-family conference last month, and I'm currently teaching a work-life course at Creighton to 16 students, including 2 of our star basketball players, which has been very interesting because as they talk about trying to manage their school and being like, in Omaha to be a Creighton basketball player is kind of like being as close as we have to a pro athlete. And so them trying to balance that has been interesting as they talk about it. So that is a lot of what I do related to this. Tonight what I want to do is to talk about 2 different things related to work life. Understanding sort of the landscape of what influences it, to then be able to make, hopefully, more informed, better choices to develop our skills about integrating working and personal life. And I'm going to start my timer so I don't talk y'all's ear off too long. So, for each thing that I dive into, we're going to go with this framework to think about work life. And I showed it in the breakout today. I'm going to break it down into all 4 parts a little bit longer, because I think a lot of us, when we think about working and personal life, take it as our responsibility to solve. Like, how do I make this better? And we don't think about all the other things that are influencing whether or not we feel integrated. And so this framework is something that I've written about in a couple articles to help us think about the multiple levels at which work life really comes into being. And so I'm just going to show it quick, and then we're going to break down each phase of it, thinking about how these levels matter because they influence each other. So I want to show the graphic just so you can see the up and down arrows, because I believe that what happens at the macro level in terms of society influences what organizations think they should be doing, influences what our relationships look like, and influences individual choices that we make about work and life. So let's break down these levels, and what I'm going to do for each one is have a transition slide and read a narrative that you might hear that emblematizes the theme. So the first one, overheard, macro structures and ideologies. Did you hear? I guess Lindsay asked about teaching online only once her maternity leave is over. And if she can't do that, she wants to just teach part-time. Apparently, she's loving motherhood, and she just can't fathom leaving the baby in childcare all day. But it's not our problem she decided to have a kid. I'm not surprised, though. Once she has a second, she'll probably quit altogether, and in the meantime, she gets the benefit of teaching from home. If I was a woman, I'd take that deal any day. Too bad I'm a guy. Sound like something somebody might have heard ever? Maybe. So when we think about this level of macro structures and work-life integration, there's 3 things that I really want to talk about that maybe we don't think about on an ongoing basis that influence our ability to integrate our working and our personal life. The first one of those being governmental policy. And if you were in my breakout sessions, I know I said a couple of times that the United States is basically, in terms of industrialized nations, almost the worst in terms of work-life balance and the policies that we have or don't have. And I just put a few examples here. There is no federal policy on guaranteed paid parental leave. When I talk about policy, some people say, well, we have FMLA, and I say we do, but Family Medical Leave Act is unpaid, and an organization has to have at least 50 people for it to apply. And so it doesn't actually apply to everyone, and even if it did, it's not necessarily paid. In contrast to countries that say, we're going to give you a year off of work at partial pay at like 65% in Scandinavia, for example. So we don't have that parental leave. We don't necessarily have paid annual leave. So we think about what's the organization going to offer me for vacation, right? And try to take advantage of it, not thinking about that in other nations, the government gives them vacation. Things like 4 weeks of paid leave in the United Kingdom, for example. Can we even fathom using 2 in the United States, even if it's not governmental policy? So this idea, and then guaranteed days of rest, are really held to in some countries, and by some organizations in the United States, but it's certainly not federal policy. So as we operate on a day-to-day level, a lot of things we have to negotiate for ourselves that if we simply live somewhere else, we wouldn't have to. So that's that macro structure that influences. Then thinking about cultural norms of ideal workers. If we think about who usually gets held up as this is a really great worker, there's some characteristics that often come to mind. Somebody who's available almost full-time, like you need them and they're going to be there. And they would cancel something in their private life to come to work, right? If they're an ideal worker. They're willing to go, I like to put in quotes, go the extra mile. I would argue, and I don't know how many of you would agree with me, let's see with a show of hands. I would argue that being a workaholic is celebrated in the United States culture. Anybody agree? Every other, like alcoholism or drug addiction or something like that, we try to help people with, right? But this one particular thing, we've sort of, because of the Protestant work ethic, said it's a good thing if you work a lot and keep doing that. And then if we're all expected to do that, it sort of increases all of our workload. So the cultural norms of being an ideal worker influences every day, even if we don't think so. If we're in a private event and we think, I should be checking my email, we've got cultural norms of ideal workers. There's someone, I don't know where she's seated in here, but she was having a medical emergency and decided that she should probably respond to a student. Like, I totally get that, right? Because we're like, am I going to get a chance to do this again? I just got to get this one thought off. But if we weren't in this culture in the United States, we probably wouldn't think that way. So we have governmental policy impacting us, we have cultural norms of ideal workers, and then of course we can never escape gendered norms of public and private and how they end up influencing where we end up with for jobs, what that ends up looking like in the public and private sphere. So if we think about gender roles, they continue to be constructed around masculine and public and traditional and feminine. And it's interesting because in the realm of teaching, what gets constructed as masculine and feminine sort of differs by grade level of teaching and what's being taught, right? What do I mean by that? I mean, we expect more women to be elementary teachers, don't we? Don't we have certain expectations, and then when we see a man, we're like, oh my gosh, look at that guy teaching elementary school, that's so cool. But where can women go that it's so cool, right? Because it's a private occupation, a care work occupation that we just sort of expect. So thinking about gender norms, and I know I shared this with the group earlier, I think one of the best examples I've had recently of how these are still really strong is I did an article in the late 2000s about commuter marriages and the women and men in those marriages, and we titled it, How Do You Get Two Houses Cleaned? Because all the women got this question about, well, how do you get two houses cleaned, not assuming that the man could clean the house that he was living in. So if that's how society still is within the past 10 years, we can see that those norms really influence us on a day-to-day basis, and not usually for the better, right? It's harmful to women to expect them to do all the care work. It's harmful to men to say, well, we don't expect that you're going to want to stay home with kids or anything like that. If you want to stay at home, it means you're less of a man, just like we might say that female breadwinners are less of a woman. So thinking about these stereotypes influences us, sometimes influences our choice of occupation. So that upper level of policy and cultural ideals and gender is operating every day, even if we don't think about it. If I had you sit there and think about, okay, over the past week, where have you seen these things influencing your life? I'm certain you could pick out at least one. Overheard about organizational norms and policies. And by the way, I have to make this a little more corporate because I wasn't quite as sure with teaching how we make it work. Guess what? Supposedly there's talk of us finally getting flexible scheduling. I heard the policy is drafted so that as long as we work core hours, we can come in earlier or later around those hours, provided of course that we work our normal amount of hours a week. I hope it's not just a rumor. I would love to work out in the mornings before I come in, but right now I don't have time to get that sweaty and then get showered before work and feel ready. I can't imagine how much more balanced I would feel if I could. I'm so excited about this flexible scheduling policy. When we think about organizational policies and norms and work-life integration, I put at the top what I think is the most important, because it's something that we might be able to have some influence over, is the workplace culture and climate, even if we don't feel like we can influence the other policies that are within organizations. So when we think about organizational culture and climate on a day-to-day basis, do I feel like my organization is supportive of family life? Is it supportive of my personal life beyond the policy? My dissertation research, one of the biggest findings that I had, and one that has really resonated with people, is the idea that a policy exists, but you can't really use it. So some places, there will be policies, but people feel like, well, it doesn't matter because I can't really use it anyways, because the culture is one that discourages having balance. So it doesn't matter if you put a policy in place if you're not going to back it up with practices that would make it work. So some people feel like they work in a really supportive environment. Other people feel like they work in a not supportive environment at all. And there are micro places where we can maybe have some influences on culture with relationships with our supervisors and our coworkers that we'll talk about. So that's one aspect that we have a little bit of play with. Otherwise, at the organizational level, it's just good, I think, to understand the realm of things that are available out there. In terms of leave policies, family paid leave and parental leave, paid time off, sabbatical programs aren't just for colleges anymore. A lot of organizations end up offering them to their employees. Some organizations will pay people time off to go volunteer. And some places are even starting to have donation programs for sick leave or for paid time off. So it's not necessarily just for colleges, but again, a leave policy is if an organization decides to do it. There's no federal mandate. Flexible working, does an organization offer things like flex time, part-time, subbing, compressed work weeks, telecommuting? Again, when we translate this to education, there's a few of these that don't make as readily of a translation, but in the corporate world, thinking about flexibility as, can I work 4 10-hour days and have every Friday off, and things like that are becoming really important, especially to graduating students. And then, do organizations offer anything related to family and parental leave? Child care or elder care services, do they give financial assistance? Those sorts of things. Creighton just went to 4 weeks of paid parental leave, and they made a very conscious choice to go parental so that it wasn't that men felt left out of the conversation or women were privileged to just do it as a flat 4 weeks. It does get sometimes interesting, and you all would face this too, when you take a 4-week leave and sometimes translate it to college courses, because I know there's some community college course teachers in here. Do you count 4 weeks as a course? How does that all play out? But what policies exist for that? And then of course some organizations have employee assistance programs to help with stress prevention as well. In terms of utilization statistics, only about 24% of organizations have a formal work-life policy in place, but then about half of them have informal. And so when you add those together, about 75% of organizations have something. It's just how formal or informal it is. For you as educators, even I'm assuming, I guess I heard this in the breakouts, that within a district, even from building to building, sometimes the climate is different for what it looks like in terms of support in the same school district with the same policies, right? And that's culture. And that's something that maybe we can try to have some bearing on through our relationships. So we'll start to talk about those Next. Overheard. Coworker and supervisor talk about work life. Can you believe it? Mary is home with a sick kid again. Seriously, can't she find someone else to help her out? I think she abuses the policy that separates sick leave for dependents and personal sick leave and uses every last day. I wish I could play hooky like that. When she's back, we should give her the 3rd degree. See if her kid was really even that sick. Let her know we're on to her. Supervisor. Well, that conversation did not go well. I asked Ashley if I could leave right after the last bell every day to get Tim to soccer practice as long as my work got done. It would save me trying to find rides for him every single day. You know what she said? If I can't see you, how do I know you're finishing your work? You might be blowing it off for all I know. Honestly, I'm still in a little shock that she actually said that. Why even say that we can have some work-life flexibility if we need to be seen at school for people to believe we are working? Can you imagine either of those things being said by someone? Maybe, okay. Maybe not exactly, but the sentiment, right, of how coworkers and supervisors talk about work life is an enabling or a constraining factor in how we're able to manage our own lives. If people talk about it positively, like, yes, go take care of your kid, and then we get to go take care of our kid, we're gonna feel better than if we ask and we're denied, and every day we're trying to have to sort of like make arrangements on the fly. So thinking about this is my biggest area of research, is as an organizational communication scholar looking at within an organization, and as a communication scholar, how do relationships influence how these things function? And so we know that talking about family and personal life has been shown to lead to greater work satisfaction and higher work functioning. So if people are able to be open about their personal lives at work, they're happier and they work better. But that doesn't mean that it works out that people are able to do that. We can think about ways that coworkers can encourage or discourage that, and ways that supervisors can encourage or discourage that. So with coworkers, some work groups are really family friendly, others might not be so much. We see work group norms and practices exert a strong effect on how much employees are willing to use benefits and what's viewed as acceptable practices. Who's working? Who's slacking, who's using the policies, who's abusing the policies. When we hear about Mary's story about sick leave, I shared with the breakout sessions that in 1997, when my first child was born, my husband's a federal employee, and so he had 6 weeks of partially paid paternity leave available to him. And we all took guesses as to how much he took, and some guessed 0, and the highest anybody went was 3. He took 2 weeks. So he took 1/3 of what he was rightfully able to take, and he asked for the most that anybody had ever asked for in his office. So why did he do that? I argue partially why he did that is because of what he thought coworkers were going to say and how they were going to react about, was he using the policy or was he abusing the policy? So one of the biggest findings that I had in my research was this idea of use versus abuse, and the ways that peers talked about this actually created a system where people, even though they had benefits available to them, said, well, I probably shouldn't do it because my coworkers are going to get mad. That's a lot to give up because you think your coworkers are going to get mad, right? But it happens. I mean, I was documenting as it happened. And then with supervisors, we can sort of see how they have a lot of power in terms of they're usually able to support or deny requests for work-life arrangements, and so they can be more supportive than the policy, or they can kind of like make the policy work for them if they don't want to support it, right? At Creighton, one thing I really don't like about our policies is it says, this policy is available by supervisor discretion. So you have to go through your supervisor to get it. And sometimes if you try it and you don't get it, then nobody else ever tries it again, right? So a lot of times that ends up being a dead end when we leave it up to supervisors versus just making it an organizational policy. And I get that there are some jobs where it's harder to have flexibility. Maybe they can, compromise on something, but just to stop it without ever going to HR in our case, I think is problematic. Especially because we know that a supportive supervisor moderates work-life conflict and predicts employee well-being. If people feel supported by supervisors, in y'all's case by administrators or whatever those people are that you report to, program directors, you're gonna work better when you feel supported. You're gonna not wanna work so hard when you feel like they're causing roadblocks for you all over the place. And so these relationships actually really have an impact, and they are at least one level where we might be able to have some agency in responding by how we talk in those relationships, how we support others. And so we'll come to that when we talk about developing skills. Overheard. Relational partner talk about work life. Confession. These are true stories from my life. So let me get this straight. Even though I have picked up the kids every day from school so far this week, and I have an important meeting tomorrow afternoon, what you are telling me is that you cannot get them, and I have to arrange for someone else to pick them up because you don't have time to. How is that fair to me? That's a behavioral example of personal relationships. We'll talk about that. My emotional example isn't necessarily a story. It's my life. And here's why. I know that all of you can relate to teachers. Professors are in ivory towers. Teachers don't have real jobs because you have summers off and things like that, right? Or some narrative thereof. It's a real job, but it's not quite a real job. And so my husband, on a regular basis, likes to say, when I say something that he doesn't agree with, well, that's what you think because you're in an ivory tower. If you were in the real world, you would understand it differently. But the thing that I think is the most emotionally unsupportive thing that my life partner does is when we all sometimes feel less integrated, right? And we're a little more panicked than usual, maybe getting a little short with people because we have too much to do. His favorite thing to say is, well, for a work-life balance scholar, you really don't have it figured out. Not very nice, right? So we think about emotional support as the ways our partners help us or don't. And I'm giving you the don'ts in general, right? We've been married more than 25 years now, it's fine. But we can see those moments. So what does that look like? When I differentiated emotional support versus behavioral support, when we think about support from our relational partners in our personal relationships, and if you're not in like a long-term romantic relationship, I think close friends sometimes serve the same function. Partners can increase or decrease our feelings of work-life integration based on their support of us. And that can be personal, emotional support, where they're just sort of trying to help us solve our problems, trying to help us make it through the day. That can be career emotional support, where they're trying to help us solve our work-related or our career-related problems. And then it can be behavioral support, when they're actually trying to help us get things done in terms of household labor and care work, which is the example of the picking up the kids from school. So multiple ways that our partners can support us, and of course the reciprocal, that we can support our partners. It's important because partner support benefits include stress prevention and sort of buffering us from the effects of work-life conflict, which is our next thing to talk about, and just increasing our feelings of overall well-being. And so when people feel supported by their partners, they do better. That doesn't mean that seems like, of course, that would be the case. And yet, even though we know all this, I know that I'm not always the most supportive partner that I could be. I know that in my relationship, I don't always feel like he is, and you can all probably think of moments where you could have been more supportive or felt not supported. And then one more thing that really influences this in terms of not necessarily the emotional support, maybe a little bit, as women are often expected to perform more of the emotional labor too, but in terms of the behavioral support, is that gendered norms often lead to a process by where women fall into performing the majority of the care for children and or elders, and the household labor often to their detriment. So when women are able to share care work and household work, it leads to greater satisfaction and well-being for them. In the breakouts, I talked about explicit ways that people can negotiate doing that, and I can, if anybody's interested, I can send more, but basically it's an awkward thing, right, to say, we need to sit down and have a conversation about how we're dividing our domestic work. But if and when people do that and get it all out in the open, versus just being annoyed that someone didn't load the dishwasher or whatever it is, it actually makes things better, but it's something that we're not necessarily socialized to do, so we don't think about doing it. So, I argue that these macro structures, these organizational policies, and relationships all sort of feed up and down in cycles that influence what we're able to do on an individual basis. Overheard how individuals negotiate work-life issues. So at the meeting I just came from, the district is considering providing all of us with iPad minis and paying our monthly bill and giving us like $50 in apps. But I gotta say, I'm just not sure how I feel about it. Don't get me wrong, the technology is exciting, but if somebody sends me an email at 9:30 at night, am I expected to answer it because everybody knows I have the technology to do so? What time does schoolwork officially stop? I like to separate work and home, and this seems like a slippery slope where I won't be able to. How many of you answer emails after school hours? I heard some people respond to Twitter. Any tweeters out there? No? Facebook, anything like that? So depends on what medium it is, but certainly I'm responding to emails after hours. So I try to sort of put in a matrix here a little bit about the ways that we think about the individual level and what all feeds into individual behaviors and work-life integration in terms of what conflicts look like, how people often cope with them, and maybe different ways to reframe them is what's across the bottom. So, types of conflict. When I talk about work-life conflict, or when other scholars do, they usually differentiate 4 different types. So it's not just one thing. So when we think about time-based work-life conflict, what we're talking about is that we feel competition for our time from multiple role demands. So I've got demands on my time as a teacher and as a parent, and if I'm caring maybe for my parents, as a child and as a volunteer and as a partner, and all these things, they all take time. When I feel like that time is competing, time-based conflict. I'm sure we all have that one, right? At one time or another. Energy-based conflict is actually the amount of physical vigor that one has for work and life. So if you come home literally physically exhausted from a day at school, are the people in your home life getting the best of you? Probably not. Have we all come home literally exhausted from days at school? So it's that energy level is another one. Then we think about strain-based conflict. We think about when role stressors in work or life induce physical or psychological strain, hampering the fulfillment of the role in the other domain. So, for example, there have been times where, based on issues with my kids or whatever, I might have more personal issues going on than others. And when that's happening, I have less patience with my students. I know I do. I'm like, that was in the directions, just go read them. I don't really do that, but I want to do that, right? So thinking about because of that strain, I'm not the same teacher that I usually am. And all of us probably have those moments. And then finally, behavior-based is when a pattern of behavior in work or life is incompatible, yet we don't make the necessary adjustments across domains. So I get this statement to me. Raise your hand if you've ever gotten this from your partner or your kids. I am not your student, do not talk to me like one. Right? So this behavior-based is like we're sort of still acting the way that we had to act at work, and we bring it home with us. And it could go both ways. And so all of those are considered forms of conflict that we should be mindful of. So how do people cope with conflict? There's multiple ways. I put a few of them here for you. We just talked about social support, right? We can really cope with it by having supportive partners. Having supportive coworkers, having supportive supervisors is all great things if we can make that happen. Active reduction techniques, and this would get a positive spin on coping, is when you try to reduce your work-life conflict. And by trying to reduce it, you're gonna prioritize things, organize, delegate. Whenever you hear those sort of management type of words, to take control, that's sort of thinking about active techniques to reduce it. Avoidance techniques wouldn't necessarily get the gold star of how to cope, but some people just try to forget about it, right? If I leave this work undone long enough, I'll just not think about it anymore. I don't know if in the K through 12 system you have the same thing. I mean, you probably peer review others' work in some way, shape, or form, but for me, doing manuscript reviews is like the most tedious part of my life. And so I'm like, it's due in 1 week? Okay. It's due today? Huh. They're going to tell me next week it was a week overdue. And then like 2 weeks overdue, maybe I'll do it. Is that a coping mechanism that's good? No. Somebody's waiting on that, but it's sort of this like avoidance technique, right? If I just don't deal with it, maybe it will go away. It's probably not going to go away. Reactive techniques are ways that we cope by trying to alleviate the symptoms of stress, and these can be more or less positive, right? So if I if I try to alleviate the symptoms of stress by doing yoga, for example, or meditating, someone might say, well, that's a good way to do it. But we probably put labels on when people turn to alcohol and drugs to do it, right? Or maybe we don't. I don't know. But it's another way that people cope, is to just try to get through the day. Some people actually end up sacrificing their own personal needs. So I know that I want to do this, but I know I can't do this with my work, so I just won't do this. I know that, whatever it is, you sacrifice what you really want for the job, or sometimes you sacrifice in the job for family. Some people procure support. What do I mean by that? This summer I'm paying my children to clean my house to get them something to do, but in general, I actually pay my sister-in-law to come clean my house every 2 weeks, because I don't want to do it, and it's worth it to me to pay that money to not have to think about doing it because I don't want to do it, because it's a source of stress for me. There's other ways that you could think about procuring support from others in terms of paying for things, having meals made for you, going to some of those subscription services. That's a way to cope. And then finally, some people end up coping by just like making a mantra, like put family first, and then they just sort of live by that, and that's a way to do it. Of course, you're going to have snags that you hit, but that is another way to think about coping. So we know what the conflicts are. We know what coping strategies are. As a communication scholar, I think about it a couple other ways too, because I think that the way that we think about the individual level is also about issues of identity and how we want to be seen. If I want to be seen as a good teacher, what are all the things I'm willing to do to be seen as a good teacher? How do I craft my sense of self as a teacher, as an ideal worker, or as a family woman, or as a family man? Any of those things, if we have this certain way that we want to be seen, then we're going to behave in ways to try to help us be seen that way. So I think that we can't think of work life at the individual level without thinking about that identity issue and how we want to be seen. And then finally, boundary management is one more factor at this level. And what do I mean by that? When we talk about boundary management in work life, we talk about integrating or segmenting or something in between. So if you're an integrator, you might have your smartphone and you're checking it here, and then if you go to the casino, you're going to check it there, and then if you go to Adventureland, you're going to check it there, and on the way home, you're going to check it, and before you go to bed, you're going to check it, because all of your life just smooshes together. If you're a segmenter, you're like, I am not on the clock. I am not looking at that email. I will look at it when I am. And then there's some people that are in between, like they'll integrate about some things, but segment about others. And I would say that there's no right or wrong way to do it, as long as you decide what works for you in terms of that, and don't allow it. The problem with integration, right, is that it can take over your life. The problem with segmentation is that you can miss out on things if you're really that segmented between work and life. So those are all ways that we think across all of these levels. So with all that said, what strategies would I offer beyond what I've already said for developing skills for integrating work and life? I'm going to talk about 4 different sort of like macro areas: being real, being creative, being innovative, and being communicative. And I cannot take credit for most of it. This site will be on there, but this book by Stuart Friedman, he's at the Wharton Business School, and they've created the Wharton Work-Life Integration Project. And so his life's work, which goes back way further than mine, is also looking at work-life issues. And in this book, he puts forward ways to think about skills for integrating work and life through 6 people, their stories, and then through skills. So just so you know who the people were, it's Tom Tierney, Sheryl Sandberg, Michelle Obama, and Bruce Springsteen are some of the people that are in here, that he shows how these people cultivate these principles to have a full life. So let's look through these as our closing ideas. His first, on all of these, if you see the little orange Asterisk, it's his tip, and I have him credited there. Things that aren't are things that I think fit along with it, that when I talk about work life, I also typically talk about. So, one tip, to know what matters, you know how important each of the different aspects of life is to you, and you know your limitations in achieving those, and you communicate what matters to you to others. So this mantra of, for example, putting family first, if that is yours, and you communicate it a lot, people are gonna expect that you're not gonna take on a lot of extra work if you put family first. Embodying values consistently, what does he mean by that? You're able to be yourself wherever you are, wherever you go. So from out there, can you tell I have blue hair? Does it depend on where you're sitting? So I haven't had blue hair very long. I was asked to be a dean in March, and I pondered, and I said, I do not want to be a dean. And I said, and moreover, if I'm always going to be a professor, why am I looking so corporate? I do not want to look corporate. And I went and I dyed my hair blue, just parts of it, not all of it. But it was like this moment of like, I want to embody like who I see myself wanting to be, right? As this sort of progressive person who cares about social justice, and for some reason for me, that meant I wanted to color my hair as well and like be anti-administration. So that embodying values consistently is that aspect of it. Aligning actions with values. You make choices about how to spend your time and energy in ways that match what you care about. So in some ways, it looks kind of silly that I took on an additional job by training for the Anti-Defamation League with what I already do. But to me, it's so important to me to be able to talk to kids and other adults about social justice issues that I don't care. Because it's time well spent to me, because it matches what I care about. And I'm sure you all have those causes too, that like, does it make sense to add all these volunteer hours? Maybe not. But does it align with your values? It sure does, and so it's worth doing, to act with authenticity in this idea of being real. Conveying values with stories. So this idea from Friedman is you end up sharing a lot about yourself to others through stories, and that lays the foundation for relationships. So don't be afraid to open up through stories, to be real with people so they know what you're all about. Envision your legacy is his idea, and then I added to it, so I'll talk about both. Envision your legacy is thinking about having a vision for where you're headed and the legacy that you want to leave. So where am I headed? And you rethink that on a regular basis. Some other communication scholars have talked about this idea, and I like their perspective on it as well, in thinking about what you want to model for future generations. And so there are times when in our home space, Bob's on his computer and I'm on my computer. And so the kids end up getting on their computers and we're not really talking. And then I'm like, is this the kind of parenting, family life things that I wanted to model? And then I'll usually break out of the pattern for a while, and then sometimes I fall back into it, but at least trying to be mindful of that. And then his other principle with being real is to hold yourself accountable to it, to be reflective and take steps to ensure that you're pursuing a life that matches what matters to you most. Are you spending time doing things that don't matter, that could go away? So all of us have things that we do that we want to get rid of that can't go away, right? I don't know about what that is for you in your teaching life, but I would much rather craft a lesson plan than grade set assignment. Other people are the opposite, right? Just sort of depends, but I can't not do that. But there are parts of my job that I probably don't have to do. So, being real. Being whole. So the first one doesn't have an asterisk because it's actually really strongly from my roots at Creighton. In Jesuit education, we talk about charisms that we think are really important to educating our students. And one of the biggest ones that we talk about is cura personalis, which loosely translates to care for the whole person in Latin. And so this idea of being whole is, and acting with integrity is always thinking about care for yourself as a whole person, not just as a worker, not just as a mom or a partner or a dad, any of those things, but as a whole person. And I think it sort of encapsulates everything that comes after. Clarifying expectations. So you communicate with people most important to you about expectations that you have of each other and make sure those expectations are clear. Helping others. You look for opportunities to help many different people and see relationships as a means for enriching your own life and the lives of others. Again, back to the idea of, do we always have time for volunteering? Maybe not, but does it make us feel good? Yes. Do we have time to watch somebody else's kids? Maybe not. Does it make us feel good? Does it do good things? Yes. Build supportive networks is his principle, and I added to it and accept that support in return. Because I think a lot of times we offer our support to others, but when they offer it back to us, we don't want to be a bother, and I think we need to be a bother if they're offering it to us because we gave it to them. Apply all your resources is his point, and then I sort of added to it recognizing your limitations. What do I mean by that? You use skills and contacts from your different parts of your life to help you meet your needs or goals, compensating for what you might not be best at. So if you know someone else that can help you in learning a new trade or whatever it is, apply those resources to meet that need. My newest goal, and it was a success, was to make homemade beef jerky. And I know this is a small goal, but my siblings had had success doing this, like on a Traeger smoker, and I was like, okay, I'm gonna try that. And it's small, right? But I didn't then have to go do all the research myself. I used what I had available to me. Manage boundaries intelligently. Delineate and maintain or integrate boundaries between the different parts of life is his point. And we already talked about that in terms of deciding, are you an integrator, a segmenter, a blend of both? He talks about weaving disparate strands together, that you're able to weave together the pieces of your life so that it has a coherence. So what are the important pieces of your life that might go across realms that continue to tell the story? So for me, I would say, I know that at the beginning in the introduction, we talked about how I teach social justice classes. And I try to raise my children in a certain way. And so I was having a conversation with this, I was being interviewed, I think for some article that someone was writing, and my daughter was waiting for me outside in the hallway while I was talking. And I was talking about white privilege. And the student came and went, and I explained and everything, and she said, "Mom, who hasn't heard of that?" And I said, "Meredith, many, 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 many people," right? Because it's not something that we necessarily would talk about, but for me, I guess I parented in the same way that I teach my students, and so that weaves these stories, these strands together. And then making health a priority is my own. I know that I choose to do that through teaching jazzercise as a positive thing. Until recently, though, I also had very negative habits, like way too many cans of soda a day, right? So all of us have our vices and our good habits on that. What do we want to do to take care of our bodies so that we can live the most integrated life? Being innovative and acting with creativity, what does that mean? Focusing on results, judging yourself and others by your accomplishments, emphasizing quality versus quantity of effort. If you've ever heard the word FaceTime, that's the idea that we can only judge if people are working by how much we see them working. And in 2016, it's a pretty antiquated concept when we have technology to be able to do work in so many ways from so many places. But some people really still don't trust that you're going to do work unless you're sitting in your butt in a seat at work. So focusing on results, you don't have to do that. Resolve conflicts among domains. You seek creative solutions to conflicts rather than settling on sacrificing one part of life for another. So a lot of times when it seems like we're at a conflict, remember we saw that coping strategy of I'll just sacrifice this and do this. And Friedman would say, step back, try to be more creative, try to think out of the box. Is there a way that you can get both things that you want by looking at it slightly differently? Challenge the status quo. You challenge traditional assumptions about how things are done, experimenting to make things better whenever possible. When I took over as chair of my department, I said to all my colleagues, I will take on this job if you understand that I'm not coming in on Fridays, ever, unless there's a real reason that I need to, because I need to get work done too. And the chair, the person who had been chair before, was in the department still. And she was not down with it because she was like a 7:30 to 5 person all days of the week, but she never took work home. I'm willing to take work home if I can stay home sometimes, so it was just challenging it, doing it differently, and it worked out really well for me, and other chairs have patterned it since, but it was different. See new ways of doing things. You're willing to question old habits and innovate in managing your life's demands. Embracing change courageously. You look forward to change as an opportunity rather than fearing it. That's, I think, maybe the hardest thing I put up there so far. Looking forward to change as an opportunity rather than fearing it. I think all of us at least have some initial fear of change, but if we can get past it, it keeps wanting me to join the hotel. We'll be fine in 2 seconds here. And we're back. Embrace it courageously is what Freeman would say. I put something under it that I just really want us to always think about working in personal life. I don't usually use the word balance because I think that assumes that you can find a static state and stay there. And what integration looks like for me today is going to be different than tomorrow, than the next day. Certainly when all of us get into prep mode for the school year to come up, it gets a lot more intense, right? And then it'll fizzle out. So from day to day, know that there's going to be ebbs and flows. And then finally, creating cultures of innovation to try to get other people to do innovative things. And then this is what I added. Being communicative, because as a communication scholar, I do think that as much as we can create open communication climates as possible, it just makes things better. Be mindful that communicative exchanges can create conflict as well as relieve it. So some conversations we come away, we're like, I feel so much better about the situation. Others, we leave and we go, I can't believe that person just said that to me and I feel worse. Don't be that person that says those things to people that make them feel worse when they're seeking support. Multiple ways we can strive to create open communication climates. At work, talk about plans to meet work responsibilities while still meeting your personal needs. And at home, talk about how to divide care work and household work in ways that feel equal. One last thing, and I put it up there, I felt like even though I wasn't an expert in work-life balance for teachers that aren't college teachers, that I should try to give you a concrete takeaway as well. So, The Guardian, which it's British, so things are sometimes pronounced differently and students are called pupils and things, but it has an entire blog on work-life balance that had a lot of great tips as I looked through it. I brought some of them into the breakout session, but a lot of articles that people could look at. So I was told to talk for 45 minutes. We are at 44 minutes and 12 seconds. I hope you've gotten at least 1 or 2 takeaways to take into the upcoming school year. And I hope you have a great conference. Thank you.